Training at CaringKind. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel for if you need to leave early, if you want to share it with somebody. A great way for learning for those who can't attend or who forgot some things that were here, and we can all review it back. And there's other webinars and seminars that are posted on our YouTube channel as well. So I want to thank you all for being here. Those of you that are not familiar with CaringKind, we've been in existence for 45 years. We cover all the boroughs in New York City. Because of Zoom, our reach is wide. And we often have individuals from all over the world actually signing on for our webinars. So we do have monthly educational topics, legal and financial webinars, water safety program, a myriad of early stage services, support groups, educational support groups, all evidence-based, evidence-informed. In addition, we have memory advocate peers, which we match individuals with lived experience with those who are newly diagnosed to help navigate. So I will put CaringKind's helpline number into our chat. But I ask that everyone stay on mute. And we're going to use the chat feature for questions. I will monitor that. Dr. Goma had said that she will do a break in the middle, and we'll be able to ask questions then. For those, I don't see really anybody, but anybody who may come, well, no one's here on a phone, so I see everybody's name so we can check you in. That's great. And I want to take this opportunity to introduce our speaker tonight on genetic testing for dementia. There's that question, to know or not to know. So Jill Goman's here. She's a professor of genetic counseling in neurology at Columbia University Medical Center, specializing in hereditary neurological disease, such as Alzheimer's disease, frontal temporal lobe degeneration, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease. Ms. Golden also is a faculty member at Columbia University Master's Program in Genetic Counseling. I have one question that I would love for you to put in the chat so we know who's in this room tonight. I would like to, if you feel comfortable, to put in chat, are you someone who has a memory loss diagnosis? Are you caring for someone who has a memory loss diagnosis? Are you interested in looking at genetic testing? Just tell us a little, are you a professional? If you can just give us a little information of who's here tonight. And I'll take a peek at that. So in the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jill.
Okay, and I'm going to bring up, here we go. All right, we're ready to go. I am really thrilled to be here tonight and really honored to be asked to be here tonight. And I have prepared a talk for you. There's a lot of information in it. So I will be welcoming any questions that you have. As Michelle said, we'll stop about halfway through because there's a lot of information, and I don't know that you can remember your questions for the whole talk. If something is super important to you at any one time, could you please raise your hand and we can deal with it at that moment. We are not going to be talking about, personal issues with dementia, either in your own family or you yourself. So your questions should be more general if they can be. Okay, so let's get going here. So during this next hour and a half or so, we're going to be doing a bunch of things. We're going to be looking at different kinds of family histories. We're going to be talking about when to consider genetic testing. We'll talk about the genes that are involved in both Alzheimer's disease and frontotemporal dementia, to give you a chance to think about a second dementia. Talk about the whole process of genetic counseling and testing and the psychosocial issues that are involved in that. Talk a little bit about direct-to-consumer testing because it is available for Alzheimer's disease. And then quickly talk about what to do if someone does test positive, meaning that they carry a gene for one of these diseases. Okay, so let's start with, I have to readjust my slides here because I can't see them. Okay, there we go. Okay, so when do you start thinking about the possibility of genetic testing for somebody who is already showing symptoms? And we call this kind of genetic testing diagnostic testing because it can actually confirm a diagnosis, or it can just say it doesn't look like it's genetic. So just in general, if someone who has symptoms does do genetic testing and it turns out to be positive, that tells us that yes, it is a genetic disease, and yes, that gene is for such and such a disease. Okay. If it turns out negative, it doesn't do anything for diagnosis. It doesn't disprove diagnosis. All it says is that this isn't a genetic disorder, or at least it is not a disorder that is caused by known genes. Okay. And as I'll talk about later, there can be a different result as well. All right. So if someone does have a diagnosis of some kind of dementia, and they have a significant family history of that same disease, it is certainly appropriate to think about genetic testing. If their age of onset is very early, and here I really mean before the age of 60, maybe 65, much after that, we're not talking about early onset disease. If their symptoms are associated with a particular genetic disorder, so something like Huntington's disease, which is 100% genetic, definitely could do genetic testing. Sometimes we're doing genetic testing when the diagnostic process has not clarified whether, for example, the disorder is Alzheimer's disease or frontotemporal dementia. And the onset is early, and we're trying to figure out whether it is one diagnosis or the other. Sometimes genetic testing can help. Sometimes we're doing genetic testing because a person is interested in participating in a clinical trial, and it is required that they know their genetic status because some clinical trials are only for certain gene carriers. And of late, and I'll talk about this more later, we're doing genetic testing to determine whether somebody should go on a particular medication, such as Leqembi. And this is really new and different in terms of doing diagnostic testing. Okay. Okay, so there's a second type of genetic testing, which we call predictive testing. And this is when the person is not symptomatic, but has a particular disease in the family, and is potentially interested in finding out their own status. So when is it appropriate to do genetic testing for this kind of person? The person has to be 18 or older, and they themselves have to be interested in finding out their own status. We would not test if a parent came to us and said, I want you to test my child. We would test if the person has had genetic counseling and really understands what they're about to get into, understands the benefits of testing, the risks of testing, and the limitations of testing. And we'll talk about all of those. And then that person really needs to be psychologically stable and should have a good support system. Okay, so whether you're doing diagnostic testing or predictive testing, there are things that you have to think about. What would you do if you knew your genetic status? Is there anything you could do to prevent or delay the disease? How would this learning of your results help or harm your life? Would it make your life better or would it make your life worse? Who are you going to tell? Are you going to tell your family? Are you going to tell your spouse, your partner, your friends? I don't think you want to tell your insurance company. And how would these results affect those people? So what about your siblings? If you found out you had a genetic disease, it tells them that they are at 50% risk. Do they want to know? Regardless of whether someone wants to know their status, it may still be appropriate to have genetic counseling. And you can have genetic counseling without ever having genetic testing. It's really a discussion about your family history, your potential risk, what it would mean for you to know, and a real detailed discussion about that will guide you through the decision-making process. And then you can say yes or no, or I need to think about this some more. If you need a genetic counselor, the best place to look is on the NSGC website for your particular area. Okay, so we're going to start with Alzheimer's disease. So we know this is not a rare disease. Before many of you got on, we were talking about how this disease is really in everyone's life, whether they have a diagnosis or have somebody in their family, they probably know somebody who has the disease. So the 6 million people in the US have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. A very large portion of those are over the age of 65. But there are about 200,000 people who get Alzheimer's disease before 65. And for these people, it is more likely that they could have a genetic cause, but it doesn't have to be a genetic cause. Only about 1% of all Alzheimer's disease is entirely genetic. And this we call dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease, abbreviated DIAD. Sorry. Whoops. There we go. Okay. So I'm talking about Alzheimer's disease first because it is by far the most common dementia. But as you can see here, there are many other dementias. And just to give you a view of another dementia that could be genetic, I will be talking about frontotemporal dementia towards the end of this talk. Probably the second most common dementia is dementia with Lewy bodies, which is related to Parkinson's disease. And there are very, very, very few genetic causes for Lewy body dementia, none which are entirely genetic. there are what we call risk genes that might increase your chance of getting that dementia. Vascular dementia is largely caused by vascular or cardiovascular risk factors. Unusual for it to be genetic, but there are some types of white matter disease that can be genetic. I'm not going to be talking about those today. Okay, so with Alzheimer's disease, we see 3 different types of family histories. And please notice that in all 3, you can have an early onset of dementia. Okay, so in this one, there's a single person in the family with the disease. And if we were to test that person, it would be very, very unusual to find a genetic cause for their disease. So this we call sporadic. Now, I didn't say there's no chance of finding a genetic cause, because there are potentially reasons that only one person in the family, would have the disease. The most common reason would be that the older relatives died too soon to actually express the gene. So if, for instance, in this family, if this man's father died at 50 of a heart attack, we wouldn't know if he would have developed the dementia. Okay, so that's the most common. Yeah, occasionally we find people who do test positive because they have a misattributed parentage. In other words, either one of their parents is not truly their parent, or that there was an undisclosed adoption or something like that. In some diseases, you can also have a sporadic cause because the mutation, the genetic change, has occurred for the first time in that person. That is extremely unlikely with the Alzheimer's genes. I have never seen it, and I've been doing this for 20-something years. But I'm never going to say never, never's never, because it is a very teeny possibility. Okay, so that's sporadic. Now I'm going to go over here to what I'm calling autosomal dominant, and I will explain that term in a minute. But what you see here is a very different story. You're seeing that everybody who's affected, the light blue here, everybody is young. So if they're crossed out, that means that's the age of death. So everybody was quite young when they got the disease, and everybody who is affected is a first-degree relative of somebody else affected. Okay? So it's not skipping generations or anything like that. And that is very different than this middle one here, which I'm going to call familial Alzheimer's disease, where there are many people affected, more than you would see in a sporadic case. But not everybody is early onset. And this person's father, and I'm going to assume that he actually died later in life, he did not have the disease. Okay, so here, it looks like it skipped a generation. So these genes that can cause this familial Alzheimer's disease are not autosomal dominant like these genes. They are what we call risk genes. So they increase the chance of having the disease, but they don't cause the disease in the same way that the autosomal dominant genes do. Okay. All right. So I already said that about 1% of Alzheimer's disease is strictly genetic. Yet we know that about 70% has some kind of genetic, not cause, but genetic risk. And only about 30% of that is explained by the genes that we know right now. So when you have a first-degree relative, so a parent or a sibling who has the disease, there is automatically a 2 to 3 times greater risk than if you didn't have that relative. Okay, I want you to keep that number in mind for a later discussion. Okay. So, it is really important, not just for dementia, but for really, all diseases. It's really important to find out your family history. And it can be, very painful to discuss this with a professional, but it really can be worth it in terms of really understanding your risk. And, sometimes you actually think that your risk is higher than it is. So by talking to a professional, you can really clarify a lot of this. One needs to remember that the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, and certainly the onset of Alzheimer's disease, can vary even within a family. Some people can be young, some people can be old. Some people can go through the disease relatively easier than others, without some of the agitation that you sometimes see. So it can be very, very different. The other thing to realize is that when you're told about, the fact that somebody in the family had Alzheimer's disease, it may not have been Alzheimer's disease, because many of the dementias were not correctly diagnosed in the not even distant past, but the recent past. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to that concept of autosomal dominance. If you can remember back to high school or college biology, you'll remember that everybody has 2 sets of genes, one from mom and one from dad. And these genes are on chromosomes. So we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, 23 from mom, 23 from dad. Okay, so you have 2 genes for every trait in every cell in your body. Okay, in some diseases like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia, in order for you to have the disease, you have to carry 2 affected genes. So you have to carry 1 gene from mom and 1 gene from dad, and they have to come together in order for you to have the disease. That is called recessive inheritance. With dominant inheritance, all you need is 1 gene that has the mutation, and that can come from either mom or dad. So that's what the dominant means. Autosomal means that the gene is on one of the 22 pairs of chromosomes that's not a sex chromosome. So it's not an X or a Y, any of the other chromosomes. That's what an autosome is. So what we see here is dad is carrying the mutation. Let's just say it's for Alzheimer's disease. But he also has a normal gene. Mom here has 2 normal genes. Every time they have a child, mom has to give that child a normal gene, and there is a 50-50 chance whether that child will inherit the the mutation from the father or the normal gene from the father. Okay, so each child has a 50-50 chance. And it doesn't matter how many children you have, each child, independent from its siblings, has that 50-50 chance. Okay, so here we're seeing a picture of a chromosome, and they've pulled out a strand here of what makes up that chromosome, which is DNA. And you can see that the DNA itself is made of 4 compounds that are abbreviated G, A, T, and C. And the sequence of those G, A, T's, and C's gives information for making a protein. So if you change the structure of the DNA, you're going to affect the protein. And that is largely what causes these genetic diseases. Not quite as simple as that, but for our purposes, it is. Okay, so there's lots of different kinds of these variations or mutations. What I'm showing here is a substitution. So here's the DNA, and there are 3-letter codes that give the instructions for building this protein down here. If I change this A to a C, I've changed this amino acid in the protein to another amino acid. And if that amino acid is sufficiently different than this one, it's going to affect the entire structure of the protein. And when it does so, the protein is not going to be able to function the way it normally does, or it actually becomes toxic. And that's what happens in Alzheimer's disease. When you hear that there are amyloid plaques, the amyloid is abnormal in the genetic forms. You build up too much of a particular type of amyloid. That happens in sporadic AD as well, but we don't know the reason. Okay, so this is just showing you in English what different types of mutations can do. Okay, so again, I have substituted a T for a G, and it's going to give the wrong meaning for the protein. Here, I've taken out a letter. Here, I've put in letters. And you know, this is just all loused up because everything in the sequence is messed up just because of a change in the reading frame. Okay, now to be more specific, when we're talking about genetic Alzheimer's disease, and I'm going to separate out autosomal dominant and the familial type, there are 4 main genes. There are some other genes that have been associated with Alzheimer's disease, which I'll mention, but they are much rarer. So for early onset familial Alzheimer's disease, or the DIAD, the dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease, there are 3 genes: the amyloid precursor gene, APP, presenilin 1, and presenilin 2. And these are the only genes that we tend to see in the autosomal dominant families. There is a 4th gene called SORL1, which we sometimes test for, that falls sort of in between these two. It is autosomal dominant in that it can cause disease, but not everybody who has a SORL1 mutation will get the disease. So in that way, it's more like a susceptibility or risk factor. The main risk factor that I'll be talking about today is ApoE. Many of you probably have heard this. It's the gene that's in the news the most. Sometimes it's called the Alzheimer's gene, which it should not be its name. And I'll talk about that later. Okay. So, going back to whether someone should have genetic testing or not, there are some issues that come up in the diagnostic testing for Alzheimer's disease. First of all, we almost never do genetic testing at a first appointment where you have your neurological exam, then you're going to have neuroimaging, you're going to have neuropsych testing. Usually nowadays they're doing lumbar punctures, spinal taps to look for the actual proteins. As I said before, if it's unclear after all that, or if the family is really interested in genetic testing, then they should have genetic counseling. And, then we can finally do genetic testing if appropriate. But the question is, who wants this information? Does the patient himself or herself want the information? Or is it somebody in the family who wants the information? Or in fact, is the doctor curious? Well, the only person that really should have the decision, if they can, and this is the next problem, is the patient. We should not be testing if there is coercion for that patient to test by somebody else in the family or even by the doctors. But then the question becomes, does this person have dementia? And if so, can they still give truly informed consent? Can they understand the information given to them in genetic counseling well enough that they can understand the limitations and the risks and the ramifications of doing this testing? And then, as we said before, last question is, who will get the result? Who besides the patient will get the result? If there is a POA, that person can get the result. But who else will the family tell? Okay, so this all needs to be discussed. Okay, so I'm just going to do a little case history that's going to sort of explain what I just said. So a 60-year-old woman with a 6-year history of memory loss presents to the clinic with her adult daughter and her identical twin sister. The daughter is the person who wants the genetic testing for her mom. Okay, so this is appropriate for several reasons, because the woman started having symptoms at age 54. Certainly that's early onset Alzheimer's disease. And her mom also had the disease and had it early. And that's all the family history we have, because the rest of the family was, the information was lost. What may not be appropriate is that the twin sister really doesn't want the information. Testing this woman who is affected would be also testing her sister. They have identical genes. This person does not yet have dementia. Okay, so here is an ethical dilemma, and our patient actually, though she did not have a POA yet, and she was still functioning, fairly well, did show confusion, did show that she was distressed by having to choose between, the two people she loved. And, it was unclear to the clinicians whether they should go ahead. After much family discussion, the sister realized that if she was going to get Alzheimer's disease, she was going to get it very soon, and that the information was more important for her niece, and they went ahead and tested and did not find a genetic cause. Okay, so this slide is showing you the kind of tests that we would do if we were thinking about doing genetic testing for Alzheimer's disease, and in this case, also for frontotemporal dementia, because it has genes for both. I should say that if somebody in a family has already done genetic testing and there's already been a variant, pathogenic or disease-causing variant found, all you would need to do is test for that particular mutation. But when you don't have that, you do a panel. And if you are absolutely sure that this is Alzheimer's disease, because all the other diagnostic testing really seem to indicate Alzheimer's disease, then you could do a smaller panel that would just have the Alzheimer's genes, the APP, presenilin 1, presenilin 2. But when you're not 100% sure, it is beneficial to do a larger panel so that maybe the diagnosis is not correct. Maybe this is frontotemporal dementia, in which case we might be able to pick up a different gene. Okay. Okay, so we could get 3 different types of results. We could say they found a variant that they know is pathogenic. It has been shown, before to cause Alzheimer's disease. It's in the databases, and that is what we call a positive result. It could come back with no variants found, and that is a negative result. Again, that doesn't disprove the diagnosis. It just says probably not genetic. And unfortunately, there's this third result, which is something called a result of unknown significance or variant of unknown significance, and it's abbreviated VUS, and we get them a lot. And if we get that result, we're in the same boat we were in before any genetic testing. We don't know what it means. We don't know what it means because there's just not enough data in the databases at this point to say that this is definitely disease-causing or definitely benign, not disease-causing. Labs go out of their way to try to classify the variants, and they sometimes say likely benign or likely pathogenic. And they do that on the basis of doing, going through databases, number one, going through population databases to see if the variant is found in people who don't have the disease. If it's found in people who don't have the disease, it's probably not pathogenic. But sometimes you can't be absolutely sure. They try to look at the protein to see if it is predicted that the change in the protein would change the function of the protein. But sometimes they really don't know. And what they do then is, look back at their VUSs in the future when they have more data, and sometimes they are able to reclassify and say definitely benign or definitely pathogenic. And the clinician, whoever ordered the testing, will get a note from the lab saying that the variant has been reclassified. I always tell my patients when they get a VUS that they themselves can call the lab in a year or two and see if there's any more information. Okay. Okay, and this is what a result can look like. And I'm sorry if it is blurred, but here it says the result is positive. It tells you that the change was from a G to a C, and it was at this position in the DNA, and that translated to a change at this position in the protein, and it changed the amino acid at that position from a glycine to an alanine. Okay, and that change in the protein is what is causing your disease. Okay, so a little switch now to a table or a figure that is showing the progression of Alzheimer's disease, and this is from a study on dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease, where they looked at people who were gene carriers way before they had any kind of symptoms. That's the pre-symptomatic stage, and they looked at it in terms of many different things. So this is what is actually happening in the brain. This is the amount of amyloid in the cerebral spinal fluid, a PET scan, a different type of PET scan, an MRI scan. Here they're looking at the tau protein in cerebral spinal fluid, et cetera, et cetera. Not until here are we getting to the actual diagnostic pieces of the neurological exam, the memory function, and past that, other types of functioning. So the actual diagnosis does not take place. The diagnosis of a dementia does not take place to here. We now know that people can have mild cognitive impairment prior to that, but that is not diagnosed as dementia until at least two areas of cognitive function are affected. But all these other markers, or as we call biomarkers, start changing a long time before anyone has a clinical symptom. And that can be, even 15 years before the actual diagnosis. So when we are thinking about clinical trials, there have been a lot of clinical trials. Most of them have not worked at all. Some have worked a little. But in terms of actually stopping the disease, we can't wait to diagnosis. So this is one of the reasons that genetic testing, can be a good thing for people who have the disease running in the family. They can test early so that if there are any clinical trials, they could be a candidate. Now, again, this is only going to apply to a very small number of people with the disease. Okay. So now I want to turn away from the diagnostic testing and think about the pre-symptomatic or predictive testing. And here we use a protocol known as the Huntington's disease protocol because it was developed for Huntington's disease. Again, Huntington's is 100% genetic. So everybody who has it carries it's really an expansion of a particular sequence in their DNA. And when the genetic testing for that disease was first starting, people were very concerned about the effects of knowing that you were a gene carrier. And this protocol was set up. So with Huntington's disease, we do a telephone screen. We hear about the family history and the motivation for testing. And we talk about something called GINA. I'm going to come back to that. GINA is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Then we do in-person genetic counseling. We ask that the person bring a support person with them. If they are in a relationship, it should be that person because that person's going to be affected by the genetic testing. If a person says, I want to do it myself, they can, but this is, a suggestion. And we really feel that bringing somebody else can be beneficial, both for the clinician and for the person considering genetic testing. And at the in-person meeting, and in-person is now also on Zoom, that, telemedicine is now considered an in-person meeting as opposed to a telephone call. We, again, look at family history, do the education on the genetics, just like I did with you guys, and then really do what we call anticipatory guidance. So we think about all the issues that could affect a person's life and have the person really consider whether that be beneficial or not. And then after that, with in some settings, there are psychiatric and neurological assessments, followed by an informed consent, blood draw, or saliva test, or a cheek swab. And then the person will come back for the results session. That will never be on the telephone. So, at Columbia, where I am, we are pretty conservative about this protocol. In other sites, they may be doing it differently. There will always be genetic counseling and consent prior to the actual testing, and then, in-person results session. Okay, so why would somebody want to do predictive testing? I would say that the most common reason I get is with late 20-something-year-olds and 30-year-olds who are thinking about having a family, and they want to make sure that their child does not carry a gene. So that is one of the reasons. Some people, say things like, I'm thinking about going back to school, but I don't want to spend all that money and time if I'm going to get sick and not be able to, practice my new career. Some people really can't deal with uncertainty, and they feel they would be much better off knowing their status than just thinking about it all the time and not knowing. And then the trial candidacy, which I mentioned before. Why do people not want to test? Some people know that they're not psychologically stable. They say to themselves, life is good now. Change that at all. Some people feel that they would have a survivor guilt because either a sibling or a parent has had this disease. Some people don't want to do it because there's nothing they can do about it. People may not want to tell their family. They may not want to upset their family. Other people don't want to be labeled as sick. They don't want the stigma of people thinking that they, have a disease. And I should say that having a gene for Alzheimer's disease does not mean that you have the disease, not at that time. People are scared about discrimination, and some people just don't want to make any reproductive decisions. They just want to do it the old-fashioned way and not have to think about anything else. Okay, so I mentioned the discrimination, the fear of discrimination, and this law called GINA. Basically, what this does is protect people from discrimination based on either just a family history of a disease or specific information from genetic testing. And this applies to health insurance and employment, but does not apply to life insurance, disability, or long-term care. It also is small businesses under 15 employees are not covered by GINA, and those working for the federal government or the military are not covered by GINA, but are covered by other discrimination laws. So when somebody is thinking about doing predictive testing, we always say to them, you might want to think about getting, life insurance or long-term care insurance prior to getting your test results. Okay, you can always cancel them later. Okay, there is not a lot of proof that this discrimination is widespread, but people are scared, and just to make sure you can get the insurance, you better to get it ahead of time. Okay, so this is just a slide to show you what one of the reproductive options is. If you do have a gene, you can do what is called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And what happens here is people go through IVF, so in vitro fertilization, and they produce a bunch of embryos and wait till that embryo is a bunch of cells. And then the lab or the doctor goes in and removes a couple of those cells that does not hurt the embryo, and will test the embryo for the gene in the family. If there are a bunch of embryos, they can select one that does not carry the gene for Alzheimer's disease and implant that gene in the uterus. Okay, and then that gene, that embryo will develop without the gene. IVF itself doesn't work all the time. The process is very expensive, emotionally draining, can be hard physically as well, but it's a wonderful option for people, who don't want to get pregnant and then have to make a decision by doing prenatal diagnosis. Other reproductive options would be sperm or egg donation, adoption, just having a baby. And one of the things that, I will share with people is that, we are talking about a disease that's not going to happen, for 50 years minimum, 50, 60 years. And we don't know what's going to happen in science by then. Things are changing very, very quickly. And it's very possible that there will be a trial or even several trials that work, and possible that we can stop the disease before it starts. So having a baby the old-fashioned way is an option. And then some people say, I don't want my child to go through what I went through with my parent. I don't want children. Okay, so lots of different reproductive options there. Okay, I think I'm going to stop right there for, for a little bit, and we'll come back to this after, we go through some questions.
Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask? I'm looking at, some people are here because, they have a number of people in their family. So they're listening to consider testing. Curious about risk factors in larger families. Anybody want to ask a question? You can write it in chat. You can raise your hand. We can call on you. Let me look at the page. We have a very silent. Oh, I have somebody good. Thank you. If parents both have the Alzheimer's disease gene, what are the chances of getting it for each child?
75%. So it's not a guarantee even then. Okay.
I think I'll let you go on.
All right, we will go on. Okay. So for those people who do have it in the family and are thinking about genetic testing, what are some of the things you need to think about? Okay, so this is really what goes on in the pre-test genetic counseling session. So I will usually say to somebody, okay, if this was your result session and I said to you, Susie, I'm really sorry, but you carry a mutation in presenilin 1. How would you react over the short term, over the next week or 2 or 3? And how would you react over the long term? And it's a very hard thing to think about, but one should not go into genetic testing without thinking through what it's going to mean to you and how it's going to affect you. So really important to do that kind of work and do it ahead of time. I learned several years ago that I had to reverse the question as well. How would you feel if it was negative? Now, you would expect people to say, I would be thrilled. That would be the happiest day of my life. However, some people really have a hard time with a negative result because they are expecting to be positive. They have spent their life thinking that they were going to be just like their parent or just like their sibling, and learning that they are negative really impacts their self-image. Okay, and they have to really reassess their life. So now we know that you're positive or negative. What are you going to do with that result? Can you use it to take control and make your life better? Or are you going to obsess every time you forget your keys or forget a word or an appointment so that you really can't enjoy your life? And I really think that if someone knows or even thinks that they are not going to be able to have as good a life as they do at the present time, not knowing that they should at least postpone their testing. Okay, again, who are you going to give your result to? And do those people want to know? And here, what I suggest is that people thinking about doing predictive testing sit down with their significant others and family who they're thinking about testing and say to them, when it's still a hypothetical, I'm thinking about doing this genetic testing. If I do, would you want to know? So that way you don't have the piece of paper in your hand and you're not feeling the need to say yes or no. And you can really listen to what your loved ones want. And again, I asked to have the partner at the genetic counseling because that partner is going to be affected by the genetic result. And people have to think about that. And it is not unusual when I, say, how is it going to affect your partner, or ask the partner themselves to hear, I'm going to support his testing, but I really don't want him to test. I'm scared what it's going to do to me. So, that is also something to think about. Same thing with the family. And it is very common for us to, tell people to have additional support other than their family and friends. And that support is a professional, any kind of therapist who they're comfortable with, who is not emotionally involved in the decision to test and can work with the predictive patient to help them, pass genetic counseling to prepare for results and to be there for them afterwards. Okay. So then the other thing to think about is privacy and who's going to get those results and what happens to them. So we talked about, who you give results to, and that is your own decision. But remember that at least in most clinics, any visit is going to go into the electronic medical record. And you want to be careful if you're concerned about, even which doctors you tell, because they could put it in the medical record where anybody can see those results. There are reasons, very good reasons, for having information in the electronic medical record, and that is so there can be continuity of care. If somebody ends up in the emergency room, they can get the medical records and see what background problems people have. Certainly in the future, it would be important to have information about a genetic condition. The question is, do you want that there when you are 20-something or 30-something years old? So this is something that you should really talk to your genetic counselor about, or any of the doctors that you are thinking about testing with, about what's going to happen with that result and how much of your visit will actually go into the medical record. We already talked about the insurance issues and discrimination. And okay, so what this other point is gold standard point is saying here is if there is a family history, the best person to test is really somebody who's affected, because then we get a very definite answer. If we get a positive, that is information for the rest of the family. If we get a negative and the person is affected, that really means nobody else in the family needs to be tested. This is not a genetic condition. Okay. Problem is these VUSs. Okay. Okay. So another case history here. This is a 43-year-old woman who called for an appointment for genetic counseling after she was referred by her doctor following predictive testing for early onset Alzheimer's disease. So here she is sort of going about things in a reversed way. She had gone to the doctor, said, I want this testing. He tested her without genetic counseling. She really didn't understand what she was getting into. And then she got stuck. The reason for testing was that her mom had died at 71 and had had early onset Alzheimer's. Her grandmother and uncle had Alzheimer's, but much later in life. And what she was told from her doctor was that she carried the gene for early onset Alzheimer's disease, and she was really terrified. So when she talked to the genetic counselor, they requested that the actual genetic result be sent, and it was. And again, this is the same panel I showed you before, but the doctor told her that she had the Alzheimer's gene when what she really had was one of these VUSs, so variant of unknown significance, and had it in this TBK1 gene, which is not an Alzheimer's gene. It is a gene that is usually associated with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, which she definitely didn't have in her family, and is occasionally, very rarely associated with frontotemporal dementia. So she was not prepared for getting her results, period, and then was told that she had something, she had a gene for Alzheimer's when she didn't. So what I'm trying to show in this case is that one should really go to a specialist from the very beginning, not to your primary care physician, and go to somebody who understands the genetics of the disease and can also walk you through the different kinds of results and how the testing is going to affect you. Okay, so trying to decide about doing predictive testing is really hard. But you got to think through the whole thing, and you can always postpone and make your decision later. This is a quote from Alice Wexler, who is she herself was at risk for Huntington's disease, and her family was very involved in the discovery of the Huntington's gene. And this book, Mapping Fate, is really the history of that discovery. And she says, choosing not to take the test is a decision one can easily revoke, unlike the situation after testing. Once you have the information, you can't give it back. And it's really necessary to think through that. Okay, so another story here. I said we'd get to direct-to-consumer testing. Well, the best known of those companies is 23andMe. And this was a young man who decided to do 23andMe. He was an IT guy, very knowledgeable, very up to date, and he thought it would be interesting and fun. So he did his 23andMe. He spit into the container and sent it off, and checked all the boxes. So he wanted all the results. And he found out that he was a carrier of this ApoE gene, and he had two of the type of ApoE genes that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. And he tried to talk to his doctor about, ways to prevent this, and the doctor wasn't particularly helpful. This was his primary care physician. So this is the kit that you get from 23andMe. And, you don't have to do a blood test. You can just spit in this container and you send it off. And in order to get your Alzheimer's results, you actually have to choose that you want them. For all the other sort of routine conditions, as well as some of the recessive conditions, so those where you need two different genes, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to check. You're going to get them automatically. But there are a few tests that they will do and tell you if you check it off. And that would be Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, the 3 Jewish mutations for breast cancer, and I think there are a couple more at this point. But you really should read the small print. Okay, so this is testing for only ApoE4. You're not going to be testing for any of those genes I talked about before. And there are limitations. They're not going to tell you all the variants that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. They are not going to tell you your exact ApoE genotype. A genotype is which genes you actually carry. So there are 3 different types of genes, that 3 different types of ApoE, which I'll show you in a minute, ApoE 2, 3, and 4. They're only going to tell you your 4s. And they say that there are important differences in the meaning of your genetic result depending on your ethnicity, and that most of the data is based on white European descent. Okay, so he took this one step further. Now, on that slide said that his sister had died of a rare lung disease, and he decided he wanted to explore and see if there was anything that he could find that would explain her disease. So he asked not only for the regular report, but for his raw data. So that means that he was basically getting his whole exome, or the express part of his genome, all of his genes, though. So the DNA sequence in many of the genes. And what he didn't expect was that he discovered he had a presenilin mutation. So that's one of those autosomal dominant genes. And he then panicked and sought me out. And I called him back and said, this raw data is not what we call CLIA approved, meaning that it's not going through a lab that is FDA controlled. And it may not be accurate. And the only way to find out if it's accurate is to have a CLIA test. And yes, you'd have to pay for that. He didn't want to pay, and he had already sent a second sample to Ancestry.com, and he was going to wait till it came back. So it came back, and Ancestry said, you don't have it. Okay, so that was a better result. And I said to him again, so you want to prove that Ancestry is right? Go through a CLIA test. And he said, no, I've already sent a second sample to 23andMe. And sure enough, it came back positive again because there was nothing that 23andMe did differently than they did the first time. He finally got a clear result, and it was negative. So bottom line here is, if you want to do direct-to-consumer testing, do the ones that they can prove, the ones that are CLIA approved. So you could do an ApoE, an ApoE test, but absolutely do not ask for your raw data. There was a study done by a different lab called Ambry, where they looked at all the direct-to-consumer testing companies and found out that 40% of the time they release a false positive. So again, I beg you, do not ask for your raw data. Okay, so let me go into this ApoE gene a little bit more. As I said, there are 3 different types of ApoE genes. An allele is a type, is a type of the gene. So there's 2, 3, and 4, and because you have 2 of them, you can be ApoE 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 2, 4, or 3, 4. If I go out on the street and test everybody, I get a distribution like this, where most of us have ApoE3 and usually ApoE3, 3, but there are 14% of the population who are walking around carrying an ApoE4 gene. If I go into my Alzheimer's clinic, the numbers change. So many more people are going to have ApoE4. So that is associated with the risk of Alzheimer's disease. ApoE2 is actually somewhat protective here. You can see that. So, based on this, we say that ApoE is neither necessary nor sufficient for getting the disease. And all the guidelines up until now said we don't recommend testing for it because it's not predictive and it's not going to give you a diagnosis either. You can carry it and never get the disease. You cannot carry it and have the disease. Okay. But it is a risk factor. And we can look at this a little bit differently. The number of copies of ApoE will influence your risk. So we're all at risk for Alzheimer's disease. That's why so many people in the population have it, even if they don't have an ApoE4. If you have 1 copy, you're at about 3 times greater risk. If you have 2 copies, you're at much greater risk, and it also decreases the age of onset in many cases. Okay. Okay, now, if you remember back to one of my first slides, I said that the risk to a first-degree relative of having Alzheimer's disease is 2 to 3 times. Turns out that's about the same as having 1 copy of ApoE4. One of the reasons not to test is not to test for ApoE, for ApoE, is that even if you don't have an ApoE4, but you do have a parent with the disease, I can't take away your 2 to 3 times greater risk. There are many other genes. The other thing about ApoE4 is that it has a different risk in men and women. So the risk to women for getting Alzheimer's disease is higher no matter what your genotype is, certainly higher if you have an ApoE4. Also, the risk differs, I'm sorry, differs by ethnicity, with it having a greater effect in Caucasians than in African Americans or in Hispanics. And part of that is because of other risk factors, and part of that is because of other genetic factors. So here is a gene that has about the same effects as ApoE4 in African Americans. Okay, so there is now some rethinking about ApoE4 testing, and that is because of the new Alzheimer's drug, this Leqembi. It turns out that one of the side effects, the main side effect of Leqembi, is this swelling of areas of the brain and the possibility of brain bleeds. And this side effect increases if you are, certainly if you are ApoE4/4, and carries a slightly greater risk in someone who is 3/4. So the FDA recommends that everybody who is thinking about Leqembi have ApoE4 testing, or at least be offered ApoE4 testing. And to my knowledge, that is what everybody is now doing. Not everybody chooses to be tested, even if they would be at greater risk. Okay, so here's sort of the overall scheme of things. On this axis, we have your genetic risk of Alzheimer's disease. And here is the frequency of the genes in the population. So the high-risk genes are those autosomal dominant genes I told you about, which are very rare. Then we go down to 2 copies of the ApoE4, and 1 copy of the ApoE4, which is more common. But overall risk is a combination of all of these genes, and there are many more. And these over here are all very commonly found, but only give a very, very slight increased risk. In some cases, they modify risk and lower risk. So you really need to take account of all of these different genes. And in research, there is something called a polygenic risk score, where there are tests that consider all the genes, and they give you an associated risk. There are direct-to-consumer companies who are doing this. I do not recommend that you go through a direct-to-consumer company to determine your risk, because it's not all genetics. We know that such things as low education, certainly head trauma, and other factors we don't even know about that are in the environment, also play a role in risk. The head trauma is particularly true in people who carry an ApoE4. So all of those things need to be considered. This is just in here because I've been thinking about it. And I think it's something for everybody to think about. There is a new blood test that is available that will indicate that someone has the profile for Alzheimer's disease, similar to what a spinal tap would do, where you're looking for tau protein, and tau is in the tangles. And in someone who is developing Alzheimer's disease, you see a higher amount of what's called phosphorylated tau in the spinal fluid, and now you can detect in the blood. And they look at the amyloid because amyloid actually goes down in the spinal fluid because it's accumulated in the brain. So by doing this blood test, you can also get a profile. My question to everybody who is listening is, would you want to know long before you get the disease? And what would lead you to want to know or not want to know? So, some of these markers are going to do what genetic testing does for people who are autosomal dominant. You're going to have the ability to find out ahead of time. Just something to think about. Okay, so let me just say one other thing about ApoE testing. ApoE is also a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And sometimes ApoE is on a cardiac panel. And cardiologists don't necessarily know to discuss the associated Alzheimer's risk. Vice versa, when you're doing it in a dementia clinic, we usually do talk about the associated cardiovascular risk because that's one thing you can actually take control of. You can lower your cholesterol, you can exercise, things like that, which will lower your cardiovascular risk. And cardiovascular risk is associated with both Alzheimer's disease and certainly vascular dementia. So there is a little bit of control there. Okay, so in contrast, I want to talk a little bit about frontotemporal dementia, which is the second most common pre-senile, below the age of 65, type of dementia, second only to Alzheimer's disease. It is not nearly as common as Alzheimer's disease, but more common than people know about. It has been wrongly diagnosed in the past. And it can be mixed up with Alzheimer's disease in some cases, but also with psychiatric disorders. There is a large range of age of onset, but the average onset is in the mid-50s. So it really is an early disease. For those who don't know anything about FTD, it can present in two different ways. It can present as a behavior change, where people have poor executive functions, including poor judgment, disorganization, lack of insight. People can become very disinhibited and do things that they never would have done before. Just, a few examples are, saying things to people that are really inappropriate, like going up to somebody and saying, "Oh, you're fat," or going up to children in a mall and petting them. These days that is definitely a no-no. Some people become very apathetic, lose interest in their families, their work, their social activities, and that can be pretty devastating, particularly when there are young children at home who don't understand why their dad isn't coming to their baseball game. People become very emotionally blunted, don't react the way that you would expect them to react. And this last symptom is almost diagnostic in the people who have it. Not everybody has it, but in some people, they just don't turn off their appetite and can become uh, food hoarders. They can also become hoarders of other things, but people can gain huge amounts of weight in a very small amount of time. Caregivers always say never to bring somebody with FTD to a buffet because there won't be anything left on the buffet. So that's one presentation. Second presentation is language impairment. And there are really three types of language impairment. Two of them go with FTD. One is called non-fluent primary progressive aphasia, where people have word finding problems, but are also agrammatic. The second type is semantic variant, PPA, or semantic dementia. And in that type, people keep talking for a while, but their speech stops making much sense because they really don't understand language, the semantic meaning of language anymore as the disease goes on. And in both these cases, they will eventually become mute. There is a third type of primary progressive aphasia, and that is logopenic PPA. And logopenic is also a word finding problem. But if you do an autopsy of someone with logopenic, you're going to find Alzheimer's disease, not FTD. Okay, so FTD is more genetic than Alzheimer's disease. About 30% of people with FTD have a family history. It's thought to be autosomal dominant. A few more, maybe another 10% have a family history of a related disease. So we're certainly not talking about all of FTD the way you would with Huntington's disease, but more than with Alzheimer's disease. And for people who have autosomal dominant FTD, there are three main genes that they could have: the tau gene, or MAPT as it's called, progranulin or granulin, GRN or PGRN, and then a very strange gene called C9ORF72, which is actually the most common gene for hereditary FTD. And this gene not only causes hereditary FTD, but is the most common gene for hereditary ALS. And it's a very peculiar gene. I'll go through it in a minute. And then there's a whole bunch of other genes, and I don't even have them all here, but these are very rare. Okay, so the tau gene, the progranulin gene, and all the other genes are a lot like APP, presenilin 1. The kinds of mutations are like the ones I showed you. This C9 gene is different. This C9 gene has a region in it that has 6 letters that are repeated and repeated and repeated. Okay, and that is true for people without the disease, but most of us have certainly less than 30, usually less than 10 repeats. And people who have the expansion in the gene and have FTD or ALS usually have hundreds or thousands of these repeats. So C9 causes about, this number may be too small. I've seen up to 20% of familial FTD, 7 to 9% of all FTD. And you can even find it in people who don't have a family history, so sporadic FTD. In ALS, it's even higher than that. Again, you can find it in sporadic ALS. Is also strange because we can't predict what it's going to look like when someone carries the gene. Can present as FTD, and the age of onset is highly variable. The duration of the disease is highly variable. Usually with the other genes and with sporadic FTD, the literature says 6 to 8 years. I think that's really too short from what I've seen, but it's a disease that's shorter than Alzheimer's disease. But if you carry the C9, it can really be a very long disease. So it can present as FTD, it can present as ALS, it can present as both. We have many families who have just FTD and C9, just ALS and C9, or some people have FTD, some people have ALS. So it's really not predictable. It can look like Alzheimer's disease, so it can be more of a memory disorder than most FTD. In most FTD, memory is relatively preserved, and it can look like other diseases. It can certainly look like other movement disorders, and even look like Huntington's disease. And very often there is a psychosis sometime during the disease if you carry a C9 mutation, and that psychosis can even occur prior to the dementia. So it's a highly strange gene. And it's also different because it's tested differently than all the other mutations. And when someone is going for FTD gene testing, you have to be really careful that the panel that you order has the special testing for the C9 gene. Okay. So ever since C9 was discovered, we've found something very interesting, and that is that many of the other genes I showed you on the panel that were associated with ALS are also associated with FTD. So all of a sudden, these diseases that were thought of as very different diseases are now seen as a spectrum. There are some genes that are unique to FTD, the tau gene, almost always the granulin gene. And one gene that is unique to ALS is SOD1 gene, but every other gene here can cause either FTD or ALS. So clearly they're related. And FTD is a bit complicated. Whoops. I'm going to skip this. Okay. FTD is a bit complicated, more complicated than Alzheimer's disease, because in Alzheimer's disease, if you do an autopsy, you're always going to find plaques and tangles, those amyloid plaques and the tau tangles. In FTD, there are 3 different pathologies that you can find. You can find tau in the brain, but that tau is different than in Alzheimer's disease. In the C9, in the progranulin cases, and in about 50% of all FTD. You find a totally different protein. You don't find tau. You find something called TDP43. And then in about 10% of cases, there's a third protein that you can find instead of the other two, and that's called fuzz. So there is some debate about whether FTD is one disease or three diseases, but much more complicated than Alzheimer's. And for FTD, the clinical trials really need at this point to be associated with a particular gene. So we have had clinical trial for the C9 carriers. There's currently a clinical trial or several clinical trials for progranulin carriers, not yet for tau. We're hoping for that. So here again is a situation where if there's the disease in the family, one might want to test to be a possible candidate for a clinical trial. Okay, so I'm just going to wind up here with what do you do if you do predictive testing and you find out that you are a carrier? How do you live with that? I strongly suggest that you join a support group. And in terms of the FTD world, Kim Jenny is on this call and is just starting a support group for carriers of the FTD genes. Certainly recommend a psychiatric referral for support. And, keep that time perspective. It doesn't do anybody any good to test and then only live for dying or for getting the disease. If you test, you should be living to make your life better today. And what you should not do is to seek out some of the supplements that are advertised or any kind of weird therapy that you hear about where there has not been a randomized trial to prove that it is actually effective. I would certainly encourage everybody to become part of research for Alzheimer's disease, for genetic families. There is the dominantly inherited Alzheimer's Network, which is run by Washington University in St. Louis, but there are sites everywhere. We at Columbia are one of those sites. And Diane has a spinoff that is Diane 2 or the Diane Trial Unit, where they do clinical trials on families with these genes. Likewise, in the FTD world, there is a multi-site research project in this country called All FTD. And really, for All FTD, all you have to do is have a diagnosis. You don't need to have a genetic form of the disease. So there's a lot out there to think about. Certainly, again, if anyone has any questions about genetic testing or about their family history, I strongly encourage you to have genetic counseling, not necessarily testing. There is information on lots of different websites. So CaringKind has information. The AFTD, the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, has lots of good information. It will at least steer you in the right direction. Okay, so we have 10 minutes left for questions. I hope there are some at this point.
There was one question earlier about does Medicare cover genetic testing?
A really good question. Medicare does cover genetic testing in some cases. for predictive testing, you're not going to be using Medicare. You're going to be too young to use Medicare. And many insurances will cover genetic testing at this point. Most won't cover predictive testing, nor do we advise it, from the privacy point of view. But some people still choose to use their insurance.
Okay, let's see. I'm just gonna read Kim Jenny's
Can I ask a
here.
question before we
Oh,
move
go ahead.
away from that? I'm sorry to interrupt,
Go ahead.
but like, so if you have an older relative that has Alzheimer's or has been diagnosed with it, and they're in the nursing home, is there any reason why you would not want to find out definitively whether they carry any of those things?
If you have it, so if that person is in their 80s, they're not going to carry, okay, early onset.
Right. But
Okay.
maybe they've had it for 15 years.
Okay, so if they have had it 15 years, if they, started in their late 50s, it would be reasonable to test that person, especially if there was a family history. Problem with doing it in a nursing home is you have to coordinate with a health professional there to actually order the test and do the test.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions from anybody who would like to unmute themselves and ask? Kim, you're still on. I'm going to let you just say what you had written in chat, just in case people are not looking at chat. I think that's good information to share.
So my name is
Kim, we can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
Yeah, you're a little broken up. You're breaking up a little bit.
Hold on. Can you hear me? No sound?
No, I hear you.
No?
It's not good.
Hmm.
Michelle, you want to read it?
Yeah, I'll read it for you, Kim, sorry. So Kim wrote in chat from the Association for Frontal Temporal Degeneration, aftd.org, has a support group for asymptomatic people who have undergone predictive testing with a positive result. And for those who know FTD in the family is genetic, but have not yet decided about genetic testing. So you can reach out directly to their helpline, which is info@theaftd.org if you're interested, or know somebody who may be interested. I think that's a wonderful resource. Thank you for putting that there.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Any
Yeah,
other questions while we have Jill here?
I'd just like to ask, so if you, you say, if you have one APOE4 gene, that has some significance, but on the same time, you also say it's not predictive and, you could have it with the gene or not have it with the gene, So what is it's a risk factor, but how much of a risk factor is that?
So those are the slides I showed you, that if you carry one copy, that your risk increases, 2 to 3 times.
Right.
And having two increases much, much more. So
it's just built into that number. Yeah.
yeah. So some people, want to have all the information they possibly could have. There's nothing they can do right now to act on that increased risk. And again, if there's a family history, you automatically have the risk. And, I should say that is true no matter what disease is in your family. And if you have heart disease in your family, you have a greater risk of heart disease. If you have diabetes in your family, you have a greater risk of diabetes. So, we are, somewhat our genes.
Thanks.
I don't see any other additional questions coming through, so I want to thank you, Jill, and all of you for being here. Thank you, Jill, for presenting. This was very informative, and a wonderful presentation. And CaringKind looks forward to having you back again.
Thank you.
But do you want to just touch on something else that you do? A friend for Rachel, do you want to just touch on just one
Sure.
moment on that?
Advertisements here.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I, now we're probably 13, 14 years ago, I started a program called A Friend for Rachel. And I started it because I also lead a support group for FTD caregivers. And, I was hearing things like, my husband is not ready for a full-time caregiver, but I can't do it 24/7 and I've got to go to work. And I thought to myself, well, students, particularly pre-medical students, might be able to help out here. So I started this program with a woman named Amy Traumer, who used to work for CaringKind when it was the Alzheimer's Association, and is a geriatric care manager. And what we do is recruit Columbia pre-medical students, so they're juniors, seniors, and post-baccalaureate students. And we do ongoing training about dementia and caregiving. They commit to a Sunday workshop once a month. And then we pair them with people who have early to moderate dementia. And it can be Alzheimer's disease, it can be Lewy body disease, it can be FTD, if they're not too behavioral. And the students meet with their friend, and that's what we tell them that they are developing. They're developing a friendship, and it has nothing to do with being a caregiver. We don't want the family to use them in that way. They are building an intergenerational friendship. And prior to COVID, it was always in person. During COVID, it was always on Zoom, and now it is hybrid. But they meet with their friend on a weekly basis for at least one academic year. And when they are in person, it's usually about 3 hours. And the purpose really is to get the person with dementia, sometimes mild cognitive impairment, to get them out of the house, to end isolation, to increase stimulation. But they do things that both find fun. We match them by interest as best we can. So they go to museums, or they go for walks in the park, or they find new restaurants. And the purpose for the person with dementia, as I said, was to end the isolation. The purpose for the student was to understand that a person with dementia is still a whole person with lots to offer and a whole history. And the third purpose is for the caregiver to get a little bit of respite time. And in addition, for the caregiver, the student has interaction with that person, and can be a support person for the caregiver as well. Much to our amazement, the person who benefits the most is the student. And of our 130 students that we have trained or something like that. At least 40% have stayed for more than 1 year. Some after graduation. They don't get paid for this. This is purely volunteered. It is a big commitment, but they get so much out of it. It really changes their lives, and hopefully they carry it with them to medical school and afterwards, and really understand how these diseases affect the person who has them, as well as the entire family constellation. So
Thank
that's something else I do.
Bill, can you put in that your website in chat for people who want the direct information regarding that?
Uh, uh,
Go to the bottom of your screen and then,
I know that. I'm
yeah,
just,
yeah.
I
and
just don't have it right here. Let me try here. I've just got to dig it up. Okay. Okay, got it. Hmm. Okay.
Great.
Yeah, I got it. All right. Got it.
Okay. People see that in chat? And there was a couple of people asking for that. I don't see it pop in there.
So I should tell you that we don't recruit until the very end of August, beginning of September.
I don't see it yet in the chat.
Really?
Mm-mm.
Oh, I went to Kim. All right, let me try again. Okay. Now, yay.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. All right. Wonderful. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody, again for being here. Thank you for attending our Monday night educational meetings. They happen every once a month and sometimes more than once a month. So check out our website, CaringKindNYC.org, and you'll be able to get a full listing of all our educational meetings. Jill, again, thank you so much for being here. We do look forward to having you back again. I thank everybody for participating, asking really good questions, and for showing up. We see you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.